Today's President's Day, and I wanted to talk to you briefly about my favorite president, George Washington. Most of you know Washington was Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and led the Army to victory over the British to secure our independence. And I think you know he was our first president. But there are things about Washington that you might not know. Obviously, he was much loved and respected by the men he led, so much so that many of them hoped that he might be, for all intents and purposes, a king. After the British surrendered at Yorktown in the fall of 1781, the Army remained in the field. The peace treaty with Britain had not yet been negotiated, so it was necessary to keep our troops together. The British still had forces in the United States. They were encamped in New York in the spring or late winter and early spring of 1783. Around that time, there were members of Washington's officer corps led by General Horatio Gates who were threatening to lead a coup against Congress. Congress had promised the officers in Washington's army, if they stayed with the army through the duration of the war, that they would pay them a pension. When it became apparent that Congress couldn't meet that obligation, the officers organized and were really planning to stage a coup against Congress. So they scheduled a meeting for March 11th. Washington found out about it and put a stop to it, rescheduled the meeting for March 15th. When all his officers gathered for the meeting, Washington walked in and very intensely denounced their plans. And then as he stood at the podium, he said that he wanted to read a letter that he had received from a member of Congress. And he very deliberately reached inside his coat pocket, pulled out the letter, unfolded it on the podium, smoothed it out, and then reached into his coat again and pulled out a pair of spectacles. And he said, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in service to my country." That vulnerability was something this man had never seen, and some of his officers wept openly. Washington finished reading the letter, left the meeting, and then the soldiers voted on whether or not to follow Washington or follow Gates and march on Philadelphia. And it was unanimous that they would follow Washington. And that saved our country. There's one other thing that I'll share with you about Washington. When King George III of England heard that Washington had voluntarily left power, he remarked that he must be the greatest man in the world. Well, I don't know if Washington was the greatest man in the world at that time, but I do think he was the greatest president that we've ever had, and he set a standard that every other president should follow. I hope you've had a great President's Day.